We've all heard stuff like this before, and most of us are disgusted by it.
Read carefully what the Bible has to say in Malachi. He says, prove me with your tithes and offerings. He said, I will rebuke the devourer for your sake. Your husband has all these medical problems because the devourer has not been rebuked. You need to rebuke him. You give your tithes faithfully, and God, he said, I will rebuke the devourer, the person who's eating up your money and eating up your health.
We don't always see it that blatantly, but we hear it all over the country. The ushers will come and take the tithes and offerings. Tithe is an old word for a 10% chunk. We see it a lot in the Old Testament when we're talking about supporting the tabernacle and later the temple. So it is a biblical concept. What did Jesus have to say about it? Oh, well, wait a minute. And actually, that's wrong. He did make one comment about tithing, but it might not be what you expect. Hi, I'm David L. Washburn, and this is Bible Insights. So what did Jesus say about tithing? Woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For ye pay tithe of mint and anise and cumin, and have omitted the weightier matters of the law, judgment, mercy, and faith. These ought ye to have done, and not to leave the other undone. Oops. Apparently to Jesus, tithing wasn't that big a deal. Yeah, he says you guys shouldn't neglect it, but there are other, more important matters that you're just skimming over, and that's what's keeping you out of the kingdom. On the priority list of rules in Jesus' world, tithing is somewhere way down at the bottom, if it's there at all. As a rule, he tended to repeat Old Testament commands that he wanted us to follow. Funny, this isn't one of them. The only people he ever told to tithe were the scribes and Pharisees. And even then, he says, if it comes down to that, or doing justice, mercy, and faithfulness, tithing is expendable. He never tells the disciples to tithe, he never mentions it to the crowd, and it is never mentioned after his resurrection. Okay, so what does Paul say about it? Well, that's no help. What about the other apostles who wrote letters? Actually, that's not correct. One writer did mention it. We just don't know who it was. Older Bibles lump Hebrews with Paul's letters. The problem is, Hebrews is anonymous. It never says who wrote it. Paul always signed his letters. It also has a style and vocabulary that looks nothing like Paul's writings. We don't know who wrote it, but we do know it wasn't Paul. So how did it get into the New Testament? In the first 3 centuries after Jesus, all kinds of writings circulated, claiming to be by the apostles, by one of their close friends, or even by one of the major players themselves, like Mary. Obviously, most of these were fakes. But there were also genuine writings out there, stuff that actually came from the eyewitness apostles and others, stuff the churches needed so they could learn what it meant to follow Christ. Church leaders from pretty much all over the known world got together to try and sort this out once and for all. It was clear to them that God had inspired certain people to write down his revelation about Jesus. It was also clear that a lot of other people had taken it upon themselves to fabricate some really wild stories and ideas and try to pass them off as apostolic. How to straighten this mess out? The criterion they used was authorship. Was this written by an apostle, such as Peter or Paul, or a companion of an apostle, such as Mark or Luke? It wasn't easy, and they didn't have anything like the tools that we have today for determining authorship of a work. They did the best they could, trusting God to guide their efforts. Some of the books we take for granted today almost didn't make it. Revelation, the book everybody loves to fight about, came close to being thrown out. So did 2 Peter and a few others. When it came to Hebrews, they decided that although there was no author named, its tone, content, and style sounded enough like Paul or someone close to him that they could accept it as inspired. Hebrews made the cut. Why did we go into all that? Because Hebrews is the only other book in the New Testament that mentions tithing. And all the references are in chapter 7, where the author is explaining why the priesthood of Melchizedek is better than the priesthood of Aaron and the Levites. His whole argument is based on the fact that Abraham paid tithes to Melchizedek. It's all Old Testament stories, and it's all purely for illustration. It has no relation to us tithing today. So when it comes to tithing, the New Testament tells us
nothing. Absolutely nothing.
It would seem that tithing is not a New Testament concept, so we shouldn't need to do it. But it is in the Old Testament, and it is commanded, so doesn't that mean we should keep doing it? I mean, even Malachi talks about it, and it's the last book of the Old Testament. Why would we quit once Jesus came? Good question. A better question is why it was done in the first place. So let's take a look at tithing in the Old Testament. Let's start with the purpose of the tithe. The main purpose was so that the priests and Levites had food. The Torah tells us in several places that the Levites didn't get a share in the land. Serving the Lord in His special place was their inheritance. So since they couldn't grow food, the tithe makes up for that. That's one purpose. That's the purpose of the basic tithe. It was gathered up over a 3-year period and given to the Levites. Anything left over went to the poor. And that was the only thing that was to be done with this tithe, thus. Then say to the Lord your God, I have removed from my house the sacred portion and have given it to the Levite, the alien, the fatherless, and the widow, according to all you commanded. I have not turned aside from your commands, nor have I forgotten any of them. There's no mention of any other purpose for this. Feed the temple assistants and give the rest to the poor. That's it. That's what the tithe was for. Feed the poor, the widow, the fatherless, anybody who's down on their luck and needs a helping hand. Let's look at that TV clip again.
Read carefully what the Bible has to say in Malachi. He says, prove me with your tithes and offerings. He said, I will rebuke the devourer for your sake. Your husband has all these medical problems because the devourer has not been rebuked. You need to rebuke him. You give your tithes faithfully, and God, He said, I will rebuke the devourer, the person who's eating up your money and eating up your health.
I don't know where he pulled that from, but he did not get it from here. The next time we see any mention of the tithe is during Josiah's massive Passover, way down in 2 Chronicles 31, just a few generations before the exile. And the purpose there was to make sure they had enough supplies so that all the people could celebrate, whether they could afford it or not. So the purpose is still to feed the temple servants and the poor. And only 2 prophets ever mentioned it. Amos mentioned it, but he was talking about paying tithes to idols, not to God. And Malachi mentioned it, but he wrote during a time when the temple was being rebuilt and the temple servants and Levites were being reinstalled in their positions. So that makes sense. But between Moses and Josiah, we have exactly zilch. Now, all those times that the Israelites were slipping into idolatry and unfaithfulness and everything else, you'd think that if the tithe was a big part of God's problem with them, at least one pre-exilic prophet would have said so. They didn't. And that tells us something very important. It tells us this is not a crucial cog in God's cosmic machine. So let's recap. First, the Old Testament. In the Torah, God commanded a tithe to feed the Levites and have resources to help the poor. So what does that mean for us? Well, does your church have Levites? I didn't think so. Does your church use the lion's share of what they collect to help the poor? I didn't think so. Then they're doing it wrong. See, this is the thing. Tithing sounds good, and a lot of churches depend on laying a guilt trip about it on their people, because if they don't, they can't collect enough to keep the doors open. If that's the case, maybe the doors need to close because you're doing something wrong. So the tithe was a support mechanism for the poor and others who couldn't help themselves. So they just brought the food to the tabernacle and the Levites took it and everybody's good, right? Be sure to set aside 1/10 of all that your fields produce each year. Eat the tithe of your grain, new wine and oil, and the firstborn of your herds and flocks in the presence of the Lord your God at the place he will choose as a dwelling for his name, so that you may learn to revere the Lord your God always. But if that place is too distant, and you have been blessed by the Lord your God and cannot carry your tithe, because the place where the Lord will choose to put his name is so far away, then exchange your tithe for silver, take the silver with you, and go to the place the Lord your God will choose. Use the silver to buy whatever you like. Cattle, sheep, wine or other fermented drink, or anything you wish. Hold on. Did God just tell the Israelites to use their tithe money to buy booze?
I said, put on some steaks and get the Queen a Bud Light.
Well, yeah, he did. Is that a problem? Then you and your household shall eat there in the presence of the Lord your God and rejoice. And do not neglect the Levites living in your towns, for they have no allotment or inheritance of their own. Wait a minute. You eat it? But that food's supposed to be for the Levites and the poor. Why is God telling me to eat it? But it gets worse. You can't just slaughter that calf and have a barbecue. You're supposed to take it to Jerusalem, slaughter and eat it there, if possible, with the Levites and people in need. But if I'm eating it, how am I giving it to them? What's going on here? If you figured it out, give yourself 2 brownie points. There's more than one tithe. This is a second 10% on top of the triannual collection for the Levites and the poor. That's right. Old Testament folks didn't tithe 10%. As we go through the law, we see more and more occasions like this where they're commanded to give more. Some did tithe 10%, but the vast majority gave a lot more than that when all is said and done. When's the last time you were okay with a commandment like that? So what's up with this other tithe? What's its purpose? Well, let's see. You take it to Jerusalem, you take it to the temple, you slaughter it and eat it in the presence of the Lord, sharing with the Levites and the poor as you need to. We sit down, have a few drinks, get nice and mellow, and have a good time with these guys in the presence of the Lord. What's that called? It's right on the tip of my tongue. Oh, worship!
Duh.
Making a special feast out of this tithe was an act of worship. And if you didn't want to do that, if you wanted to keep the livestock or the grain or whatever, you could just buy it back for its street value as 10% of the crop, right? Wrong. If you're going to keep it, add 20%. So now we're up to roughly 25% of our total income or crop or flock production. Do you give a quarter of everything you make to your church? Then guess what? You're not tithing. At least not in the Old Testament sense. If you really want to be able to say that you tithe the way the Bible describes, you've got to give between 20 and 25% of your income. But even more, you've got to take half of that, go buy a whole bunch of food and liquor, and take it over to your church and have one heck of a blowout party. Ever done that? Yeah, me neither. Maybe we should. It might make a lot of churches a lot more interesting to go to. Is that what that guy intends to do with the money he's wheedling out of that woman? Are you kidding? We don't know what he intends to do with it, but you can bet that's not it. So he has no business telling her or anyone else to tithe, especially to him, because what he's doing is about as contrary to God's revelation as anything else people have ever come up with. What about the rest of us? Should we be tithing? Well, if it's something you really want to do, go for it. If you think it's an obligation, no, it's not. And if that's your view, you should stop doing it. If you miss a payment, nobody's going to send you letters threatening to repossess your soul. Well, that's true of most churches. There are some, but I digress. Tithing is another Old Testament concept that was fulfilled in Jesus, the sacrificial lamb. We don't have Levites anymore. We don't have a temple anymore. But even before the Romans physically destroyed the temple in Jerusalem, Jesus said that's not how we're doing things anymore. He made that pretty explicit when he went into the holy place and ripped the temple veil in two. No more priests, no more Levites, no more sacrifices. we're doing things differently now. And that answers our earlier question. Why would we stop doing it once Jesus came? Because he fulfilled the law, the old order. The tithe, as part of that old order, has been fulfilled, and it doesn't apply to us anymore. It was fulfilled in Jesus' death and resurrection, so it doesn't apply to us in a post-Jesus world. In its place, we have offerings freely given, and if we're doing it right, it'll usually add up to a lot more than 10%. But there is one idea that we can draw from the Old Testament tithing instructions that might be useful.
Come on! We'll bless them all until we get fish naked.
No, that's not it.
Let us give praise to our Maker and glory to his bounty by learning about beer.
No, and do not neglect the Levites living in your towns, for they have no allotment or inheritance of their own. But wait a minute, you said we don't have Levites. No, we don't. But what's going on here? The family brings the animal or whatever to the temple, they slaughter it, and they sit down to eat a meal as an act of worship in the presence of the Lord. But the Lord isn't the only one there. We know part of the tithing program is to share with the poor, and guess what? They're probably there, and you're supposed to share your meal with them. You know what this is? He's giving us a perfect picture of a massive, open-air, share with everybody church potluck. The kind where you mingle with people you don't know and get to know them by sharing a meal with them. And there's a reason why we're supposed to do this. Because if we're too insulated, it's way too easy to stop seeing these people as our equals. It gets way too easy to sneer at them, tell them to get a job, tell them they need to be drug tested and all that crap when they're just nameless faces passing by. Get in there and learn their names. Understand that those are people just like you, and you have no business looking down on them because you're just as big a sinner as they are. Maybe bigger.
That's a nice verse.
Now, both testaments also make provision for government assistance to help the poor, but on top of that, we're called to get out there and mix it up with the least of these. I don't care how scabby that hand is, shake it. That's a real person. Make him feel like it. Jesus went so far as to touch lepers, and you can't bring yourself to give that man a bowl of soup because of the way he smells? Shame on you. Can you honestly see Jesus doing that? If you can, I need to introduce you to somebody because you're following the wrong guy. Get over yourself. You have no right to that arrogance because with a little snap of God's fingers, that could be you. Never forget that. Cram your pride where the sun never shines and get busy. That's the whole idea behind Old Testament tithing, and that's the whole purpose of New Testament offerings. The purpose of offerings was never to sustain the church itself. It was to sustain needy members of the church. And here's something else you're not going to like. It was done with no questions asked. No income verification, no asking why they're not out there working at some dead-end slave labor job, no testing to see if they've been drinking or using drugs. In fact, God doesn't seem to care if they were drinking or using drugs because he commanded the people to go buy booze and share it with them.
Drinks are on me.
Here's what it boils down to. No judging. And let's be honest with ourselves. When you put those kinds of restrictions on the help you're willing to give, you are judging. You're saying, they're not as trustworthy as I am, so I need to take steps to make sure they do what I want them to with what I give them. Not your job. Stop judging, and again, get over yourself. You are every bit as common a human being as that person is, so you have no right to feel superior. Get over yourself, learn a little humility, and go serve that person the way Jesus would. Oh, and if you can't keep your little judgmental comments to yourself, shut up while you're doing it. That's all the time we have for today, so we'll finish this up in part 2. I'm David L. Washburn, and this is Bible Insights. Thanks for watching. We'll see you then.